As you'll know, the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, speaking of some big numbers, will be spending $28 billion over the next 10 years in the region. So what the big question is for me is, what is that going to do to ease the congestion and reduce the costs associated with so many people spending so much of their time on the clogged arteries of our city? Well, hopefully to answer this question, please welcome the Director, Auckland Strategy and Investment at the Ministry of Transport, Karen Lyons.
Tēnā koutou, ko Karen Lyons, ho. Mō te tare o te Manatū Waka. I'm really happy that I work for a ministry that has Waka in its title, because most days I feel I'm paddling absolutely furiously just to keep up with what's going on in Auckland. It's my pleasure today to be here to talk about the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, fondly known in Auckland as ATAP. And I say fondly because this is truly a cross-agency project. So all the agencies represented on this slide are partners in ATAP, and front up today I do want to acknowledge my colleagues across these agencies. I'm the spokesperson today, but I'm representing the work of many. I also say fondly because, as you've heard probably at least 3 times today, ATAP is a $28 billion investment package for Auckland. That's good news, and it's bigger than any previous plans. So, what concerns us in Auckland? I guess this picture really says it all. Our trips are taking longer, and our trip time is increasingly unpredictable. I'm sure you've all had to leave extra early for an appointment because there's just no telling these days how long it's actually going to take you to get somewhere. And of course, we all have our traffic stories, and mine today is about the Motorway Express Bus, which might sound like a bit of an oxymoron when you look at that picture. So this was the bus I used to run for when I was a student. If I could get on that at 5 o'clock at Simon Street, I could be all the way back out to South Auckland in 35 minutes. Out of interest, I looked up the bus timetable today, and that very journey by bus takes 2 hours. The good news, though, is that you can get a train today, and that's 59 minutes according to the timetable. And even better, we have our train station at the bottom of Queen Street now, whereas in my student days it was a 20-minute walk away from the city centre. As well as congestion, safety is a big challenge. This is now a #1 priority for government and also a top priority for Auckland Transport. The safety story is a national story, but as you can see here, it's accentuated in Auckland, with Auckland having seen a 70% increase in deaths and serious injuries since 2014, compared to a 30% increase for the rest of New Zealand. And then finally, to set the scene, this shows that we are not harnessing all of the benefits that our significant population growth should offer. This chart shows that Auckland is losing its edge over the rest of New Zealand in terms of productivity, whereas you might hope that our biggest city, with its scale and its concentration, could be doing better than other areas. And so we know all that. I'm just really telling the room what you already know, but it's always important to set the scene. And I think what that does emphasise is that it's, without a question, really important that central government and Auckland Council and Auckland agencies can join forces to work together on transport planning and investment, which is what ATAP is all about. ATAP has been around in Auckland for the last 2 to 3 years. It encompasses prioritising investments, as well as maximising the performance of what we already have, and it also looks at managing travel demand. ATAP does have a 30-year time horizon, and that point was made by a previous international speaker. For ATAP 2018, which I'm focused on today, however, we were asked to update the investment part of this framework and focus on the next 10 years. And the reason we were asked to do that is that the new government wanted to make sure we were aligned with its priorities, and Auckland Council had refreshed its 30-year plan, the Auckland Plan. So ATAP 2018 had a very clear direction set out by our political decision makers in these objectives shown here. The government and Auckland Council wanted a package that was integrated with Auckland's urban development, and in fact, more specifically, through a rapid transit network, transport that would drive urban development. The direction was about active transport modes, about walking and cycling. It was to emphasise access to jobs, to education, to recreation. It was about safety, environmental and health benefits. And these were much broader objectives than previous ATAP work had had to focus on. And it did mean we had to think a bit differently about how we put together a priority package of investments. Now, the great thing about being involved in ATAP is that it isn't a plan that just sits on the shelf, and I'm sure we've all been involved in those over our years. With ATAP being agreed by Cabinet and Auckland Council, it gives very strong direction to the implementation plans that we have guiding Auckland, the Regional Land Transport Plan, the National Land Transport Plan, and this time with the introduction of a regional fuel tax in Auckland, ATAP provided the basis for the projects that are being funded through the regional fuel tax. The other important thing about ATAP is that it is a funded package, so that means that things can happen. So at a glance, this is the ATAP package, and I'm not expecting you to read all of that, and I'll touch on some of the more major projects in a minute. But perhaps if you can read on the right-hand side the investment areas, you will see that it is a balanced package. It's a mix of public transport, of active transport and roading, as well as a significant amount earmarked for safety programs. But the biggest thing that stands out there is the rapid transit category, which is $8.4 billion allocated over the next 10 years. So looking at rapid transit, in ATAP we define rapid transit as being high volume and frequent services along a dedicated route. Some people refer to these as congestion-free routes. It includes dedicated bus routes, heavy rail and light rail. The map here shows the strategic rapid transit network that Auckland works to. Again, you don't need to see the detail. The important point is that there is a plan that Auckland is working to. And really, when it comes to investment packages, it's just a matter of how quickly do you fill this plan over time. At the moment, the rapid transit network in Auckland is reasonably undeveloped. We have our heavy rail to the south and the west, and we have our dedicated busways to the north. Over the next decade, however, we will see significant focus on expanding this rapid transit network. Central to this transformation are the two light rail corridors that the Minister mentioned earlier this morning. When Cabinet endorsed ATAP, Cabinet also agreed to an acceleration of these light rail corridors with an immediate focus on the city centre to Mangere route. It also changed legislation and charged the New Zealand Transport Agency to deliver these two light rail routes for Auckland. Both routes are seen as catalysts for transit-oriented development. With the city centre to Mangere line, areas such as Mangere, Mount Roskill and Onehunga offer significant development opportunities. And of course this route has the great advantage of being anchored at either end by significant employment centres, the city centre and the airport. With the North West line, it is again fundamentally about driving urban development. So when we think back to those objectives of ATAP that I put up earlier, it's very much about transport to drive and catalyse urban development. As well as the light rail, just to note some of the other rapid transit improvements earmarked for the next decade. Very big is the completion of the City Rail link, with the significant increase in capacity that will bring to our whole rail network and mean that finally Britomart is no longer a dead end. We also have extension of the Northern Express Busway to capitalise on the success of this service to date, and quite a lot happening in heavy rail. Additional electric trains, electrification of the rail network from Papakura to Pukekohe, a third main rail line between Westfield and Wiri to help separate out passenger and freight service services on one of the most congested parts of the rail network. But of course, the roading network also remains very important. The difference between the roading network that Auckland works to and the rapid transit network is that much of the strategic roading network has actually already been built and filled in Auckland. But with the next decade, there's still significant projects that will be taking place as listed here. And the focus as we went through this exercise was to think about particular choke points on the network, such as the widening of State Highway 1 in the south, Mill Road also in the south, and Penlink in the north. So, getting to Nadine's question, what does this all mean? So, many of the results that I will present here are from the Auckland transport model, as well as having to think about other pieces of information we could use given the broader objectives. So, turning to the outcomes, what will ATAP be expected to deliver by 2028? The package delivers benefits for safety with a 60% reduction in deaths and serious injuries on the transport network. It supports environmental outcomes with significantly lower emissions despite an increase in travel demand. We also anticipate stronger health benefits with the benefit of lower emissions as well as more active travel by Aucklanders. Turning to access, so on the left-hand side there, we're looking at access to employment, and it looks at access by car within a 30-minute time horizon and access by public transport in a 45-minute horizon. The orange bars are bigger than the blue bars, signalling an important increase in access from this package. And then on the right, we're looking at mode share. So what we can see there is a bigger orange bar than blue for public transport. So public transport starts accounting for a bigger mode share in Auckland. These sorts of metrics are really difficult to shift, and that actually is quite a significant shift when we're looking at proportions of travel. And then also a shift in mode share for walking and cycling. So, talking now about congestion. So I don't expect you to get too much detail out of this map, but they are the maps that we sort of pore over when they come out of the transport modelling work. All you really need to be able to get from these maps is that where there is red, there is congestion, and where there is black, there is even more congestion. These maps probably show two messages. One, congestion is dispersed in Auckland, and two, when we look at 2028 compared to 2016, there is still a lot of red and black. Looking at the data in a little bit more detail, we've got morning peak congestion shown on the charts here. First of all, looking at vehicles on the far left, quite steady in terms of the percentage of time, the percentage of travel time spent in congestion, sitting at around 39%. Looking again over at the right, which is again for vehicles, splitting it into our arterial roads and motorways, we see a small reduction on one and a slight increase on another. Turning back to the first chart, we see a significant increase in terms, a significant decrease in terms of public transport, in terms of time spent in congested conditions. Now, looking at these charts, I think there are probably two ways of looking at them, and that might depend on how you're feeling today. So, on the one hand, some of you might be thinking, all that investment, but really we're seeing small improvements or steadiness in congestion. Whereas some of you might be thinking, congestion does not get any worse. In some places it gets better. And this is despite the addition of 300,000 people to Auckland over this period. That's adding about 75% of a Wellington over the next 10 years. Inter-peak congestion has been an increasing concern in Auckland. What we can see here is some steadiness again in vehicles, significant decrease in terms of public transport, and then looking over at the right-hand side, better outcomes in terms of what's happening on our arterial roads and our motorways. This is quite important, particularly when you think about business trips and freight during the interpeak period. And for business and freight, what we can infer is that if congestion is steady, but more people are using public transport or active modes of transport, then there will be more capacity on the roads for freight traffic. So, congestion largely doesn't get any worse. It improves in some instances, and that's against a backdrop of continued strong population growth. But what these results really do highlight is that investment, that is increasing our supply of public transport, increasing our supply of roads, while very important, is not the only answer to congestion. Looking at the demand side of the equation is also critical. And so I am now going to cover a specific ATAP project that is looking at congestion pricing. So the Congestion Question project, again, is a joined-up project between central government and Auckland Council. Around the world, there is now a shift to thinking about more demand-side interventions, commonly framed as, we can't build our way out of congestion. This project is very much at the investigative stage. We're looking at a wide range of ideas for Auckland, and we're setting ourselves up for some very thorough assessment of any options that we develop. We've looked internationally, and we've been able to directly engage with the OECD International Transport Forum and countries who have or are looking at congestion pricing. I don't have time to go into detail today, but I'm going to flick through a few international case studies and just highlight the lessons that we've taken out of them. As many of you know, Singapore is the world's most advanced country when it comes to congestion pricing, with charging along corridors and within areas, and using pricing to actually target particular speeds. One important lesson we took away from our case study of Singapore is that we're not likely to get things perfect from day one. Singapore's system is very sophisticated, but it has evolved over 40 years. Also, even though Singapore will be the first country to move to satellite GPS-based pricing, which means you can have different pricing at different times of day, it's the economist's dream, in the first instance, they will just use the technology to replicate their existing system so that they can help people get used to a new way. London has charging within its central area, but I imagine when you have travelled to London, like most Londoners, you didn't spend much time driving into the city, instead taking advantage of excellent public transport. So it's easy to see that Auckland will need to look carefully at what alternatives people have to driving before going ahead with congestion pricing. Although it has had some success in reducing congestion, the London scheme is now widely considered to be quite blunt and not that effective. For example, having a flat all-day charge means that some trips are charged when there is no congestion. Stockholm is an interesting example of how to build public understanding and support. Stockholm gained public acceptance through a full pilot that proved charging would reduce congestion. This was followed by a referendum that gave a narrow mandate for its introduction. And key to this acceptance was demonstrating that the scheme would have an impact from day one. So, as always, Auckland, of course, is different, but it's important to get some lessons from international studies. Compared to the other cities that have introduced pricing, Auckland does have a lower proportion of people using public transport. It does have dispersed congestion. And in particular, it's going to be very important that we consider how congestion pricing could impact on low-income families. Parts of Auckland with the highest deprivation often correlate with car dependency due to poor public transport. So for us, equity considerations are really critical in the work that we're progressing. Equity can be a complicated issue, as there is no one definition of what constitutes an equitable outcome. For example, is it equitable if people on lower incomes pay the same as those on higher, or if people in one part of the city pay and others don't? Perhaps it's not fair if some people have no choice but to drive, whereas others could have taken a bus or train. So we'll need to think very carefully about equity considerations. Our timeframes for congestion pricing are that we need to bring together all the analysis. If we are to progress beyond the investigative stage, that is a decision for ministers and Auckland Council. If pricing does proceed, there'll need to be legislative change and there'll need to be work done on mitigations. Public engagement is also key. Although transport circles have been talking about congestion pricing as a good idea for a long time, the same sort of discourse has not yet happened with the general public. Bringing them along is critical. The regional fuel tax has generated a lot of discussion about how we pay for transport, so we think we're probably now in a good position to begin having a discussion about congestion pricing and whether it's right for Auckland. Very quickly, wrapping up, ATAP 2018 will bring substantial improvements, in fact step changes to Auckland, catalysing urban growth, improving travel choice, access, safety, health and environmental outcomes. Transport modelling shows congestion for vehicles is largely steady over the next decade and improving for public transport. This is despite significant population growth. It is also worth noting that models are good at predicting past trends, but not so good when trends change significantly. In Auckland, we have already seen that when you provide better trains and better bus services, people do use them. The trend towards more public transport usage will only increase as the ATAP investments occur, and models may not predict shifts in behavioural change that well. I think we'll all agree that we are looking at a new Auckland, as these great photos show. We've got the new underground station at Karangahape Road for the CRL. We've got light rail coming up Queen Street, and Queen Street is pedestrianised. We've got more cyclists. We've got places built for people, not for cars, and not shown here, but the expectation of more transit-oriented development around rail and light rail stations and stops, reducing car dependency. Demand management is important to complement investment. The focus with ATAP on public transport and rapid transport means that the city will be better placed to introduce pricing if it is decided to do so. As always, transport requires a multi-pronged approach, and in addition to what I've talked about today, optimising what we have, embracing new technologies, and fully integrating land use and transport planning are all important. In Auckland, it is also essential to have the joined-up central government and Auckland Council approach embodied in ATAP. I'll finish once again by acknowledging my ATAP colleagues. It's exciting to be part of the ATAP collective working on transport in Tamaki Makaurau. Ngā mihi nui.